right? So in the world of product development, I'm kind of what you might call a subject matter expert in the area of palette building and trend tracking, specifically within knitting and yarn. So while the information I talk to you about in this presentation will cover a lot of stuff about fashion trends and how they influence crafts, in most cases, the yarn world and the textile world that's outside of fashion, the craft side, follows these trends a little bit slower and even develops individual trends within our market that don't exist through fashion. So the work that I've done designing color palettes has been for a variety of brands within this market. I've worked directly with dyers, indie dyers, to co-develop colorways to fit a theme or a target audience. I've worked with dye houses, large and small, to have colors developed with both acid and natural dyes. And these customers, these clients for me have ranged from maybe selling a few items, a few dozen items per month, to selling tens of thousands of units per month. So I've really worked with this huge wide range. I got my start working with a brand that's very well known for color, Malabrigo yarn, and have worked with them kind of continually bits and pieces over the past few years. I worked at Knit Crate and Yarn Box, which were the two largest subscription companies. Knit Crate is still going. I still do color work with them. This year, actually, I'm helping them plan their 2023 line right now. So this is work that I'm actively doing and have actively been doing for probably about 7 years. So I feel really confident speaking about it, but there are a couple things that I definitely want to stress as I begin this chat. The first one is that color is a highly subjective matter. Everyone's going to see color a little bit differently based on their personal feelings related to a color and the visual capacities that their individual eyes have. So your eyes have a system of rods and cones that grant you access to visual library of color. And every person is restricted to exactly how many cones and rods they have. Women generally have more, I think it's rods. So they see differences between color a little more closely than men. Obviously, color blindness is a thing that occurs in both sexes. And there's some theorizing that actually a huge percentage of the population has an amount of color blindness in specific spectrums. Usually the ones that are the most sensitive are the yellow and green tones. So if you've ever looked at a green and you said that green has a lot of yellow in it, and somebody's like, I don't know what you're talking about, I only see green or I only see yellow. That's from that experience. Your sense of color for yellow green is a little bit stronger than that other person. As a personal anecdote, as we age, color changes for us as well. So when we work with color, we have to be constantly thinking about the way that we perceive it might be different than the way someone else perceives it. And in a market where most of our customer does skew a little bit older, we do have to be sensitive to how our customers see color and not just how we see color. So an example would be that my mother recently had LASIK surgery. A couple years ago, she had LASIK. And before she had LASIK, she bought new curtains for her bedroom. And they were the prettiest, like dusty blue-gray shade. They were so pretty. And I came and I visited her and I said, oh, what lovely curtains. I love that shade of blue. And she looked at me and she said, the curtains are gray. And I was like, I'm pretty sure they're blue. And she was like, nope, they're gray. They're gray, but a cool gray. And I was like, no, they're blue. So we argued about these curtains over and over for like years about these curtains. What pillows go with the curtains, what artwork goes on, everything would bring up these curtains. So she goes and she gets LASIK. She comes home after a week and a half healing. She texts me and she says, I'm so sorry, the curtains are blue. So it was just a perfect lesson in everybody sees color a little differently. And if you knew my mom, you'd be like, wow, she has great color sense. It's not like she doesn't know color. She's an artist. She worked as a graphic designer for decades. She's done so much work with color, but her color perception is just that much different than mine, that we looked at the same color and I said blue and she said gray, and we were both pretty set on the color we picked. But when we were evened up, you know, we saw it the same way. So just remember that your audience is going to see the color a little bit differently than you are. And not everyone is going to love every color they see. And sometimes they're going to say something like, I hate that orange. And in your head, you're going, that's very clearly a red. And it will happen to you, and it's okay. You just have to let it go when you're working in color like this. The other thing I want to touch on is your taste and your customer's taste may vary. And that relates to kind of the same thing. What you love personally is beautiful because it's beautiful to you. And that's your own vision and your own taste, but only to a point. You want to mix in with your taste, your interpretation of fads, along with facts and data from your business about sales, about industry sales as a whole. And I'm going to talk about that in this presentation, and also about what's available to you. A color palette is important to develop for your brand because it further cements your brand identity. It attracts your specific customer, and it lays a path for you to follow. Jumping in and just dyeing whatever you want is like a very artistic, fun way to do things, but it's not very sales geared. So if you can combine both the sales side and the artistic side together, it will benefit you more in the long run. So I'm going to talk about some terminology that will come up throughout if you start studying trends or fads or fashion at all. This terminology will come up a lot, and we'll also use it a little bit more in the presentation. Color fads are short-lived trends. They are bursts usually of popular colors, and we see them a lot everywhere. Some examples are like this lime green, which is a fun color to see on the runway. Green is not something that we see a lot of, kind of especially in this bright lime shade. Something to note about this though, is that this color of green is not usually a great seller. And some other examples might be like an orchid pink, that really neon baby bubblegum pink is making a big comeback right now. Sorbet orange. Orange is always a difficult sell to, especially to yarn people. Orange and yellow just don't move very well. Generally, people have an aversion to orange. And then this grass green, neons sometimes come in and out. Right now they're in again. Who knows how long that will last. A color trend is a fad that sticks around for multiple seasons, and trends appear again and again and again in different variations. So the highlighter trend could be considered probably a trend now instead of a fad, just because it seems to keep coming back every late summer, every early summer, every spring. There's some new interpretation of a highlighter color. At H&H this year, which is the show that just occurred in Chicago area, it's an industry show, Mary Jean and Carol attended, and they noticed that there was less speckles yarn shown. So that's something that could be sort of fading out. That's been a really strong trend for several years now. Another recent noteworthy trend, so this is some speckles yarn, and another recent noteworthy trend is this hand spun style gradient yarn. So brands like Spin Cycle and Feederbrook Farms and Fully Spun have been doing kind of these hand spun style yarns, and we're seeing more people approach them. We're even being asked to spin more of them. So people are asking about them all the time. Color staples are colors that stick around every year and continually sell well. In yarn, the color staples have been the same for my entire career, for like 12 years, maybe longer. I don't want to count. Red, this kind of like classic red, lipstick red, is always asked for. If you have a yarn shop, you should make sure you have at least one yarn that's worsted weight this color. Gray, any kind of heathery gray, from the lightest grays all the way to black, sells really well. Black, but especially a natural black, a heathered black, sells really well continually, and natural white. And when I say that it sells really well, I'm talking big numbers that I've seen from multiple companies. So I've worked with Premier Yarns. These are the top selling colors for both their Premier brand, which is a big box store brand, and their Universal Yarns brand. Barocco, these are probably on their top selling colors. Blue Sky Alpaca is probably on their top selling colors. So pretty much every big brand has a version of this in their line. And whether you're dyeing yarn or buying yarn or designing a yarn with help, you want to have these colors available. A color palette is a mix of colors formulated and chosen to inspire your customers and evoke a sense of your brand to carve out a very specific visual identity. So to the right is a color palette that I expanded on. This is an existing color palette for Malabrigo yarn. And then I went in and added colors from some of their other lines to make suggestions about how to round out one of their seasonal offerings. When I do this kind of work, I'm taking information that I've already been presented, which is the existing colors in their line, and I'm filling gaps. So if you've already got a pretty extensive collection of color, maybe your yarn store, we had some people talking about they've got yarn in stash, or maybe they're an artist and they're putting together different colors for a weaving project or a shop kind of situation, or you have an existing yarn line and you've got colors that are proven sellers and that you identify with, you can look at what you have and then find gaps in your palette. And so that's what I did with this huge palette here. And this is a big undertaking, like 50 plus colors is a lot. Okay. So one of the things that everyone was really excited to talk about tonight is following trends. And following trends is kind of a really hard thing to do in the craft space compared to, for example, if you're in the fashion space or any other textile industry really outside of craft, because everything outside of craft is really heavily dictated by fashion trends. So you can look at it and know, okay, we saw this color on the runway, people are going to want this color of socks from our sock company, or towels can be influenced by interior design trends. Or somebody could say, oh, we're trying to develop, a palette of rugs, and they might be looking at fashion for that and also at other interior trends. So within craft, we're always at a different speed, a different pace, and a different interest level than the fashion industry and the textile industry at large. We can look at and reference some of these resources that fashion uses, but I also want to recommend looking at other non-fashion resources you might not think about. Obviously, craft-specific social media accounts. On TikTok is becoming massive. Instagram, both of those places you can follow a variety of people who are involved with the craft. You could follow someone that you wish was your customer, follow your target audience and see what they're buying, what they're stashing, what they're talking about, what colors their projects are. That can help kind of influence some trends, give you some ideas about what's popular. Interior decorating, and then pop culture. So here's some examples of these resources. The first is one of our favorites at Battenkill is to reference Pantone's palettes. So Pantone releases a palette every season, and then they release a color of the year. Most people know the color of the year, but they don't know the colors of the season. So this is the autumn season palette. And you'll see here that some of these colors would translate so well to yarn, and other colors might not be really great sellers in yarn. And usually the way that I sort of determine that is by thinking of all the ways that a color can be used. The more a color can be used, the more longevity it has in this space. The less a color can be used, the more short-term it should be on your shelves and your offerings, the more of a fad color that it is rather than a trend color. So looking at this Pantone palette, we see, of course, classic red. We see a classic cream color. So we got both of those already in our core. We see a gray, which for wool people could easily turn into a heathered gray. So they're also selling to that palette. We see kind of a navy, which I know is one of Mary Jean's favorite colors. Navy is another of those classic core colors. Then we've got like a nude and a sage. Now this bottom row is what Pantone has labeled as their autumn core. So these are colors that they think will stay season after season for a while. I agree with pretty much all of these. I think the green especially is a new addition this year. Green has been so popular. And this sort of sagey green is a play on the brighter, springier sagey greens that we saw in early spring. So spring this year, especially in workout clothes and athleisure, saw this kind of green that was in between a grass green and a new shoots kind of green. It's like the color of a sunflower sprout. And it's not a very wearable color, but this interpretation of it is much more wearable, which is why I think they put it in the core. On the other side of this chart, at the top, we have this other green, Amazon. This emerald green has been really prevalent for fall on the runway. I'm going to show some examples of that further on, but it's like a Loden green, it's a classic cabin green, it's a John Deere green. This is a color that people prefer a little bit darker in yarn, just because it's really hard to wear a bright Kelly green sweater, but it's much easier to wear a forest green. The olive, the caramel, and the midnight speak very heavily to some equestrian references we're going to talk about. There are fashion trends right now. And then the rest of the colors in this palette are really bright. So we've got a bright yellow, a bright orange. Those are not going to be massive sellers in yarn. That kind of aqua blue is very hit or miss for people. The two pinks are very prevalent this year in fashion. I probably would not go with two pinks in a single palette if you're developing a new palette for a yarn, just because pink is kind of a very maybe, maybe not color for people, but it's a great additional color to roll out later. And then the red, of course, is a classic. So that's Pantone's take. Now we can look at the seasonal fashion shows and think about where these colors are pulled from to give context. So this is that red. It showed up all over the runway for fall. We've got a lot of references here to classic Valentino red, the bottom of the shoe red, red lipstick. So there's just this really strong red, and red is an attention-grabbing color. Then we've got those highlighters coming back again to haunt us for a millionth year in a row. And the highlighter yellow has been really popular in knitting for a while now. I think we're going to see more pink showing up this year. Pink has really had a strong moment, but that highlighter yellow just won't die ever. It's going to be around for a long time. All right, then pop culture is something that I talked about referencing. I don't know if anyone in the audience has watched Bridgerton, but Bridgerton is a hugely popular Regency era inspired romantic TV show. It's a production, it's over the top, it's not historically accurate, but what it is incredibly beautiful and a lot of fun to watch. And so people just get all about these Regency era colors, these pastels, these super feminine details. Is that something that translates into yarn? Yes and no. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes, how that kind of influences different things. And then another show that's had a massive influence is Euphoria. Euphoria is like a dark teenage drama on HBO. And when I say dark, I mean really dark, really, really dark. And the girls in Euphoria dress, they wear such skimpy clothing for me. And it's so intense to watch this show. And these girls are wearing like almost nothing. But it's been a huge movement in Gen Z culture. And Gen Z is the next generation of crafters. So we do have to be aware that they love this kind of like glitzed up, faux glamour, kind of like, I don't know, it's sort of a play on the cheap look, but it's like tongue in cheek the whole time. So that sense of playfulness is beginning to enter the fashion stuff, and it's beginning to enter all the other textiles as a result. So it will start influencing knitting. And I've already seen lots of designs that are kind of inspired by ensembles from the show or in the same style or something that you might see one of these characters wear. So even if you don't want to watch the show, look up some of the fashion from the show because it's really crazy. It's fun. It's early 2000s referential. The costumes are fantastic. So that kind of segues into my next point, which is that we really need to look not just at the colors that we see, but also beyond the colors that we see to see how trends influence these palettes. So I'm going to go through a couple of trends for fall and read between the lines to tell you what each of these would mean or maybe tell us in regards to color trends. So this first one's equestrian. It's the classic Ralph Lauren. This is a picture from an older campaign, but I just love this sort of maximalism, the horses and the saddle colors and the textures. And this kind of palette works really well if you have a farm store, if you have kind of more of a rustic vibe. You can pull from this equestrian trend into your own brand, and it's going to feel at home there. Another trend that we've been seeing is really bold, bright color blocking. So color blocking or super graphic garments, that's been a huge thing. In knitting, we've seen quite a bit of it. I'm going to show some pictures of that in a little bit. If you want to look up this fashion trend specifically right now, I would look up Avant Basic. And the idea being that it's next to or aside from basic, which is a way of saying just like the average person, I guess. And so it's very bold, it's very highly graphic. If you love a lot of color, you might think about how the colors in your palette play together for color blocking or color work or stranded knitwear. You might think about working on some samples that take advantage of this. Stephen West is a good example of a designer who's doing a lot of work in this area. James Watts as well. So if you love bright and bold, this is the trend for you. If your shop or your brand is all about color, maybe think about branching in this direction. Another fun one is that Bridgerton inspired super feminine, ultra soft, candy coated pastel palette, which we see here from a variety of runway examples. It's that baby pink, it's a lavender or purple, it's super soft aqua. So if, for example, you have a very sweet, shabby chic kind of brand, you use a lot of soft color, you might think about bringing one or two of these trendy soft colors into your palette for just the season. What we'll also see from that are a lot of sheer fabrics. So mohair is probably going to stay around for a lot longer as well. Oversized is yet again here to stay forever and ever, but in a very bold, kind of intense way. We saw a lot of like big puffy coats, oversized coats, shoulder pads on the runway, making a statement. So what this kind of tells me is people are ready to make a big statement, and just this oversized shape is going to stay. People are comfortable. They want to wrap themselves in something comfortable, but they want to go outside again. They don't want to stick with the loungewear. They're ready to venture out. So I think we're going to see a lot of oversized pieces that really have that comfort away from home vibe, and then some really dramatic silhouettes. In fashion, we saw these big coats, but I think in knitting, we're going to see more balloon sleeves, which a lot of peat knit patterns, some Sari Nordland patterns have taken advantage of already. Gregoria Fibers has a pattern or two that kind of fills that niche. So if you have the kind of brand that's either a very comfy, comfort focused brand, or you have the kind of brand that's up on trends, it might behoove you to make a sample in a very wearable color for a large sweater. So you might be thinking like, oh, well, I want to interpret a couple of these colors that are more neutral, because then you'll have sweater knitting options. And I apologize to anyone who's a real cowgirl out there, but the disco cowgirl is here to stay. She goes to festivals and wears fringy, fun outfits and cowboy hats and unironic cowboy boots. And she's glittery, very, very glittery. So if you're into kind of that fun, a little bit wild, rodeo show queen pageant vibe, this could be a really fun segue to us seeing more tassels in patterns this year. This could be more fringe on the edge of shawls. If you think that your customer would like this, even if you don't like this, maybe that's a way you interpret it, is kind of these Southwest palettes with maybe a shawl that has fringe and beads. That could be a fun way to play with it within a brand that maybe you don't have, iridescent, crazy, silvery sparkle yarn, but you do want to capture this kind of Coachella vibe, then you can get that in different ways. So when I look at those kinds of trends, I'm just always thinking about how could this be interpreted in a pattern, in a yarn color? How would I feel about it? Who would buy it? Who's the person who would buy it? So when you're developing yarn for knitters or weavers or crafters of any kind, one thing that we have to acknowledge is that the yarn is probably not going to get used right away. It's going to go home with them, and then it's going to sit in their stash, maybe for years. And what you hope as someone who's designing a yarn, selling a yarn, that eventually it does get used, which means that your colorways need to have a certain amount of longevity behind them if you want to be the kind of yarn brand that has longevity. If you want to just follow and chase every trend, that's okay. But just know that your customers are going to see that progression. If you think that you want to dye things in little batches over time, and that's your thing, then people are going to say, oh, it's like art and there's only a few of them ever, and I buy the ones that I need right then. If you want to be the type of brand that has the ability for a customer to say, I really love that blue that you did 3 years ago, and I never bought it and I always regretted it, would you do a custom order? Then you need to think about that palette. When we do things with the mill, everything is based on color formulas. We make sure that we know how to redevelop a color for a customer. And I try to do the same thing with any of my clients, is have colors that have a sense of longevity to them. Now, obviously that doesn't preclude any fun. You can still do fun things. You can still put a hot pink, but I want to make sure that it's always in your mind that it might not go on the needles tomorrow. Additionally, knitting has a way of picking up random trends years after they've gone fast fashion and runway fashion. So like those geometrics I was talking about are making a huge appearance in knitting patterns. Both of these patterns were released within the last 2 or 3 years. I would say the major geometric trend, especially this specific geometric trend, had its moment probably 3 years ago in fashion, and it's still kind of carrying through. It's not like it's disappeared, but now it's really hit knitting and people are excited about it in our space. So that's an example of a trend that you might see coming before it actually ends up in our space. And then another trend that's kind of funny that happens in knitting, but also in fashion, is the return of everything. It all comes back around. But sometimes, especially right now with Gen Z, they love to rename different styles. So for example, I would say that this outfit is classic and timeless. This is Cape Cod classic, right? There's nothing, unusual about it. It's preppy. Well, this has been renamed by the younger generation as Coastal Grandma. And Diane Keaton is the ultimate coastal grandma. And the idea is that coastal grandma, yes, it's like Aran Waite sweaters, sun hats. It's images of seaside affluence in the late 80s, early 90s, all romantic comedies. So everything that goes around comes back around. Have faith in your own taste, the things that you like, and then just use the trends to inspire you and influence you, rather than determining what you're going to make based on what's in fashion. Because the longevity is important to your customer and to your brand. And whatever you like will eventually come back around with a new name, like Coastal Grandma. In the same way, when I build out a palette for a brand, I ask a few questions. So one of the things that I would start with is, what does the brand's existing style already communicate? If your existing brand is all about rock and roll music and you love, dark, moody colors and, big, heavy fonts, I'm not going to suggest that you take advantage of the highlighter trend. If you are a very woodsy, outdoorsy, rustic, traveling sort of brand, I'm not going to suggest that you start using those candy Bridgerton inspired colors in your line. The first thing that should identify the color palette should be what you've already done, what you're already creating, and what you already feel related to and strongly about. Because if you've already attracted the customer that's used to what you're doing, it's really important to retain them and continue to serve them what they're interested in, and not just every passing trend. They have enough brands that are doing every passing trend. And with how much time everyone who is involved with the mill puts into their yarn, you want it to be valuable for a long time. How many colors are we creating? So starting with a color palette that feels attainable and retainable is really important. I would not suggest, unless you have, a massive budget, to also hire test knitters and sample knitters and models and photography. I would not suggest that you start out with a line of 50 colors. Maybe just start with a line of 5 colors, 10 colors, 15 colors, a dozen colors. If you want to go really big, like 18, 20 colors, you can expand any color line that you begin. And each season is a new opportunity to do that, but you can only make a first impression one time. So pick the best colors, like narrow it down and pick the best ones and introduce those first, the ones that speak to your brand the most. What season are we releasing in is super important. Is it a spring palette that we need to focus on, or an autumn palette? Right now, Mary Jean and I are in the throes of developing the Oysters and Pearls fall palette and then the spring palette. And we have to think about how we're building on the existing line, which colors will be repeated in spring, which colors will only be fall colors. And you should be doing the same when you think about color. What is the material that we're using? Is the wool, is the fiber matte? Is it shiny? Is it heathered? All of these things have an influence on how your color is going to look. When you're thinking about dyeing yarn, whether you're having someone else dye it for you or you're dyeing it yourself, think about each layer as a transparent layer, not acrylic paint where it just goes directly over and you don't see the other color through it. Your first color is the white, the gray, the beige, the tan, whatever your base fiber is. Then you're putting a transparent layer of the next color on it. So if you're putting a transparent layer of blue, you want that blue to be the right color for a shiny fiber. It's going to reflect a little differently. You want it to be the right color for a matte fiber. Some colors just feel weird if it's too shiny or too matte. So definitely experiment, or ask for feedback. Do people want, if they want a shiny yellow, what comes to your mind? Gold. That's what you're thinking of immediately. A shiny yellow is gold. But when you think of a matte yellow, you can have that like sunshine yellow. Now, maybe you drifted a little more towards a harvest gold and it works in either palette. So just think about what the color evokes for you, what color you think of when you see that material, because those colors are going to translate best if they resonate with a part of our brain that reminds us of something that we like. And then the last thing I'll ask you is, who is the customer? And this goes back to knowing the target customer for your brand, who's shopping with you regularly. You want to know their age and who they are, but you want to know what kinds of things they like. Would they be into Coastal Grandma? Would they be into Avant Basic? Do they want geometrics? Do they want bright colors? Ask your customer what they're excited about. Don't ever be afraid to see what other brands are doing that are getting people pumped up. You should be following companies that you emulate and that you want to be like, but you should also be following competitors, people that have different tastes than you, just so that you can kind of keep an eye, because you might see something that drifts across the feed of someone who does neons and you're like, wow, that's a spectacular blue. That would go great in my line. Maybe I need to interpret my version of that blue. And you wouldn't have seen it if you were only following the people who do what you already do. The best place to start is by defining your rainbow. So when I help people choose colors from their stash, or I teach a class, sometimes it's like an art-based class, and we form color palettes in the class. When you start, I always tell people, think about what your color identity is. So when I tell you, pick a red that you love, think of a red in your mind that is like your perfect red. Maybe it's a really rich, juicy cherry red, that dark, deep cherry red. Maybe it's the red of a classic sports car. Maybe it's a neon red that just feels like it radiates warmth. Which one of those reds feels like you? When you're developing your palette, you know your customers are going to want a red. They're going to want an orange, a yellow, a green, a blue, a purple, a gray, a black, a brown, maybe a pink. How you choose which of the variations of those individual colors should always be dictated by what you love and what by extension your brand wants to present. So we were talking earlier about how maybe a rustic, super rustic, woodsy brand probably wouldn't release a hot pink. But what kind of pink would they release? A soft mauve, like the pink of the horizon when the sun is setting. Maybe they would release a dusty, beachy pink, like the color when you travel to the beach and you're hitting it at just the right time of the morning, and it's got that like light pink shine to it. If you are a cottage inspired, shabby chic, light and bright brand, you're probably not going to roll out that Kelly green, that lime green as is. It's not going to slide effortlessly in. But what would is that soft sagey green, because it's like little leaves and clover. So always think about the association when you're building out your palette, and think about what holes in the rainbow you need to fill. And you don't have to fill them all at once. Maybe you start with, your core colors of 10 colors. And so it's the rainbow and then a couple extra colors that you love. And then the next season you realize, oh, we could use another orange, or we need a green, or we need a blue, and you slide something else in there. It's all an expansion on what you're already doing, but it has that same identity through every season. And this involves a lot of planning ahead. So in the same, continuing what I said, each time you think ahead and you develop those colors for the next season and the next, you're just continuing to tell the story of who your brand is, who your farm is, who your sheep are, who you are as a dyer, each and every time you introduce something. And you can also take the time to reevaluate which colors are not performing well from season to season, what's not selling in your shop. Maybe you don't have a lot of sweater knitters, so you're not selling as many neutrals. Maybe you have sweater knitters, but they like bold color and you aren't moving, you aren't moving anything that's not really intense. Maybe the jewel tones consistently sell well for you, so you should roll out more jewel tones. Just always be reevaluating the information and the data that you can plug into your color creation process. At Battenkill, we have a lot of options to help you if you don't feel confident planning your own color. If you're not a dyer, if you need to have something dyed, we work with hand dyers, commercial dyers, natural dyers. We've got people who do hand people who do kettle dyed solids for us. So we can schedule a color consultation meeting. Just reach out to the team and we'll get it set up and kind of help you plan out what's next. We can also put you in touch with those dye houses or be your liaison. We really love to be the liaison between you and the dye house because we know their process and we can make it easy for you. But if you want to be super hands-on, we'll let you do that too. So we're here to help. I am always interested in talking about this. I'm always excited to talk to anyone about ideas that they have for their brand, or they want to talk about a color palette development. This is my favorite thing to do. So I love talking about this tonight, and we're going to stop recording for a minute and then open it up for questions.